Hi everyone and welcome back. Now we're going to talk about how to live common law and protect your assets. Please help me welcome Andrew Feldstein and Mary Tersigni. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, my pleasure. Now this is a very interesting topic for me. Well, for a lot of our crew actually. So what is a common law relationship? Obviously there's marriage and then there's the common law relationship. So what are the differences? And let's start with you, Mary. What is common law marriage, or relationships, I should say?
Well, living in a common law relationship, first of all, you don't go through the official marriage ceremony.
Okay.
So you're not married. You live in a relationship that would resemble marriage. It has to be at least 3 years in length.
Okay. So why do people choose to live in a common law situation? Is it because they think, well, if we break up, then I don't have to give this person half of everything I own? Is that what you would think, Andrew?
I think a lot of people view it from that perspective. Unfortunately, they're wrong.
They're wrong.
They're wrong.
Okay.
Because once you hit that 3 years, whether you're married or not married, you may be obligated to pay spousal support. Or even if you have a child within that first 3 years, then you may also have to pay spousal support.
Really?
That triggers common law earlier than 3 years.
Okay, so
And
what is the definition of a common law relationship?
It's a relationship resembling marriage, as Mary
Yeah.
said, for at least 3 years.
Or
if you've had a child and it's a relationship resembling a marriage that's of some permanence.
Okay. All right. So does that mean, so after you've done the 3-year mark or you've had a child, and then things go sour, as half of every marriage or common law relationship does, right? That was the stat. It was half, 50% of.
It's a little bit less, but that's roughly.
It's around there.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what happens in terms of child support? Is who owes who what? How does that work? How do things get divided?
Well, with respect to child support, it's going to depend on where the child or children are living and which parents the child or children are living with.
Okay.
So if the children are living with mom, for instance, then dad will have to pay child support to mom. Or vice versa. If the children are living with dad, then mom pays child support to dad. It's really based on where the children are living because it's the right of the children to receive that support.
Okay. And how much can the wife in this situation expect to receive for the child from the, I want to call him, but
Call him the payor.
The payor parent.
Okay. From him.
It depends on how much he or she makes, really. And we look at the child support guidelines. We look at how many children are involved in the situation, and the guidelines tell us how much the person would expect to receive on a monthly basis.
Okay, so let's talk about then benefits. So in a marriage, let's say CPP or a retirement savings, as an example, are they entitled to that as well now in a common law?
Now you've given one of the most complex questions for a family law lawyer, because one of the biggest distinctions between married and common law is that under the Family Law Act, spouses are entitled to what we would call an equalization of net family property. But to be entitled to that, you have to be married. If you're not married, you don't have an entitlement to an equalization of net family property. And that's the concept everybody talks about of the sharing of the assets, the pension, the house, things of that nature. Where it gets very complex is you then say, well, if I'm not entitled to this, am I entitled to something, and how? And the courts have crafted something called trust interests.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court of Canada recently called it a joint family venture.
Okay.
And if you've engaged in a joint family venture, you could say, I've put efforts in, so I should get something out. Now, that becomes very complicated because what is a joint family venture?
What is that? Yes.
And that's something we're all trying as family law lawyers to understand. I mean, there's the simplest case where if you say it's a 25-year common law relationship and one person went to work every day and the other person stayed home and raised the kids, and it resembled a long-term marriage in every aspect, you can expect the numbers coming out are going to be very similar if they were married.
Okay.
Now contrast that with a 4-year relationship.
Yes.
And no kids. And somebody came into the relationship and owned a house.
Right.
That other person who didn't own the home in a short-term relationship with no kids is probably going to get very little. Whereas if they were married, that person would be entitled to property claims.
So let's say, okay, so with the house situation, so let's say the guy owned the home and before he married this woman, I'm going to go back and forth between marriage and common law. So he owns this house, he gets married, they now join whatever, and they're living together, they're married for, let's say, I don't know, 2-3 years, now they break up. Is she entitled to half of that house, even though he bought it before?
That's also a complicated question.
Okay.
And here's the reason why. We start off with, we have to do our calculation like we would in the ordinary course, where we would put that house that the husband owned on his side, adding up all of his assets, add up all the wife's assets, subtract them by date of marriage, and whoever grew by more during the marriage has to pay half the difference to the one who grew by less. However, one of the exceptions, and this is what makes it more complicated, is that when you get married, if you bring a house into the marriage and it's the matrimonial home on the date you separate, you don't get to subtract that as a date of marriage asset. So for example, if I got married and I have $200,000 in a bank account and I separate, I get to subtract that $200,000, so it protects me. That I get to, in essence, take it out.
Okay.
But if I brought in $200,000 of equity in a home, I have to share it.
You just blew my mind.
Now, there's a further exception to that.
Okay.
If it's a marriage less than 5 years,
Yes.
then you could say that would be unconscionable for me to share that $200,000 with my spouse.
Okay.
And then a judge has a discretion to say, would this payment on that $200,000 for a 2-year marriage shock the conscience of the court? So it's a very complex question.
Oh my goodness, I'm sweating just listening to all of this information. That's crazy. So, so we talked about the child support. We talked about property rights a little bit. What is, I guess, the biggest myth when it comes to common law versus marriage? What should we?
I think one of the biggest myths is the concept that you're entitled to the property division. And the second, as far as I see it, big myth is that people think they're entitled to their equal share of the home,
Yes.
and in fact, possession of the home.
Right.
Because one of the distinctions in the Family Law Act is that if you're married, you have an equal right to possession of the matrimonial home.
Okay.
If you're not married, there is no matrimonial home by definition, and as a common law spouse, you don't have that automatic right of
Right.
possession.
No matter
same as
how
a
long
married.
you've been together.
Exactly.
Okay.
But you have to be very careful. If I go back to that example of a 25-year relationship, if I advised one person to say, well, you're the owner of the home, change the locks on the door and lock your spouse out,
Right.
the optics of that in front of a judge are horrible.
Okay.
And the way it's going to play out in court will be very negative.
Oh, really?
Contrasting that with a 3-year relationship and somebody doesn't want to leave and you own the home and you had full equity in the home. So there's a lot of common sense that you need to apply in understanding the
Okay.
law.
So real quickly, should you be writing things down if you're in a common law relationship, saying this is what I brought into the situation, this is what I want out of it?
First of all, don't just write it down.
Okay.
If you get married or you're common law and they get together, go put your bank statements in a safety deposit box if you have bank statements with real assets. Because you need to have that. That's what I did.
Well, we're going to continue this conversation and talk more about common law and then the myths about divorce. So please come on back. It's a quick break.
Yeah.